So for that, let's go to coach registration and replace this dummy text with a proper template. Here, I want to have a section, let's say, where I say in a H2 tag, register as a coach now. And below that, I want to have the entire form for signing up. Eventually, this component will grow a little bit later once we add HTTP requests, and therefore I will outsource this form into a separate component right away. Add the coach form.view file here in components coaches, and then we'll have the actual form in there. So here in the template, I want to have a form element, of course, because we'll have a form in here. And this form needs a couple of controls. Because every coach has a first and last name, areas of expertise, a description, and an hourly rate. So we need these input fields in our form. Hence here, I'll get started by adding a div with a class of form-control, which is important for styling later, where I now add a label saying first name, and below that, input field with a type of text, and let's say an ID of first name. Therefore, this label gets the for attribute and points at this element with this ID. And then I'm going to duplicate this because we also, of course, need a last name. So here it's last name on the second input. And then we also need an input for the description. So duplicate it again for the description here, pointing at description. But now here it's not an input, but let's say a text area element, so that we have a multi-line input. I'll give that an idea of description and let's say 5 rows. Then again, I'm going to copy the default input here and set up the hourly rate input field. So here the ID is rate and the type here can be number or should be number to make sure that we allow the user to enter a number here in a pleasant way. And now as a last step, users should be able to choose their area of expertise. Now that means that I want to have 3 checkboxes where users can check the expertise they have. So front-end, back-end, and career. And you can select as many as you know, or as many as you feel comfortable teaching others. So therefore, again, I'll add a div here with a class of form control. This doesn't change. Control. But inside of here, I now first of all want to have a h3 tag where I say areas of expertise to let the user know what these checkboxes will be about. And then I'll have more divs in there. Every div then holds an input of type checkbox. And this first one will have an ID of frontend and a value of frontend. The value will be important later for retrieving the checked checkboxes. And after the input, also a label for frontend in this case, where I say frontend development, letting the user know what this checkbox means. And now we replicate this twice to also have a checkbox for backend with a value of backend for backend, and here saying backend development. And then on the last checkbox here, I say career with a value of career for career and saying career advisory, maybe. Okay, so these are the different checkboxes here. Now with that, below all those divs, I'll add a base button, which will be the submit button in the end, where I simply say register. Now that's the basic form. We'll come back to that markup later. We also need to add bindings, and I also want to add validation later, but that's a start. With that form created now, we can add our script area here, our script block, and add some data here. So here I return a data object, and in there, I of course want to manage a first name and a last name field, which we will bind with vModel later. Add a description and a rate, which initially is null, let's say. Areas, which initially is an empty array. And that is it. Now we can bind these data properties with two-way binding. So here on the first input with vModel, I bind this to first name, which is that first name data property we just added. Then here on the second input, I of course bind it to last name. Here on the text area, that is bound to, description. And here the rate, that is bound to rate. Now here I will use the number modifier to force a conversion to number. I showed you that this should happen automatically if the type is number, but to be super safe, I'll force it here. And whilst we're at it, I'll actually add trim on the other vModel usages so that we always trim excess whitespace. And with that, only the checkboxes are left. And here we can also use vModel, as you learned earlier in the course. Here we can bind this to areas. And here we bind to the same property on all checkboxes, of course, because they all belong together. Now with that, I'll go down to the script part again and add a method that should be triggered when the form is submitted. Hence, I'll name it submit form. And in here, we will later validate the form, but for the moment, I'll just create a form data object where I group all those values together. And here I want to have a first key, which points at this first name, a last key, which points at this last name, a desk key, which points at this description. And you could use the same names, of course, here, but I'll go with these names. And I will also use these names later in the course, so maybe you should stick to them to follow along smoothly. Bind the rate to this rate, and areas to this areas. And then, for the moment, I'll just console log my form data here to see whether that worked. And now it's submit form, which is bound here to the submit event on the form element, where I use the prevent modifier to prevent the default of an automatic request being sent to a server that doesn't exist, which I don't want here, and bind this to submit form like that. And now we can use the coach form here in coach registration. So there in the script area, we import coach form from going up to components, coaches, coach form.view, and then adding this here to the components option like that. And now we can simply add the coach form as a HTML element, so to say, here in coach registration. And if we load this, we see this form. Now it's of course super ugly, so there are two changes I want to make. First of all, in coach registration, in this section, use the base card to wrap the h2 tag and the form. And inside of coach form, I of course prepared a couple of styles which we can use. So here at the bottom, we add scoped styling as always, and then attach to find styles which you should copy in here, the coach form CSS file. There are some styles which we're not even using yet, like the invalid styles, but we will need them later once we add form validation. With that, if you save this, this all looks much nicer, and now we got our registration form in place. And if I click register, I print an empty object here, and I get a warning, which we can ignore here for the moment. But I'm getting this object here. And in this object, we see, of course, that everything is empty because we haven't entered anything. So if I clear this now and do enter some values here, like that, and register this, now we see our values here in areas, which is wrapped by a proxy to be reactive. We see frontend and career being checked. We see the other data as well, and therefore we are ready to pass that data on to coach registration, and in there, then use it to create a new coach in our Vuex store. That's what we're going to do next.